Hello, today I'm going to talk about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which is a classic piece of feminist scholarship and talks very specifically about women writers, and so really kind of perfect for our course. And you can see then the kind of historical resonance of what she's talking about, and we can think about how what Woolf is saying has resonance or not with our own experiences today. First, I'm going to start with a little bit of biography, and I'm sending you a link to a Films on Demand biography so that you can see more of her life, but this is a good enough place to start. You can see her dates: born in 1882. Her father was a man of letters who came from a family that was distinguished for its public service. Both of her parents had been married before. They brought 4 children to the marriage and had 4 of their own, so it was quite a large family. All 8 children lived with their parents and a number of servants. But in 1895, her mother died unexpectedly, and Virginia Woolf suffered, or Virginia at that point, Stephen suffered her first mental breakdown. She was allowed uncensored access to her father's library, which is kind of important to think about. And from an early age, she was determined to be a writer. Her formal education was, as was kind of typical for that time, a little bit sketchy, and she never went to school, but she certainly was very highly educated in terms of her own reading. So from 1904 onwards, what's known as the Bloomsbury Group met very regularly at the home of her brother Toby in Bloomsbury, London, and Toby and his sisters Vanessa and Virginia and their brother Adrian hosted quote-unquote at-homes when they and their friends conversed about art, literature, and philosophy. Bloomsbury writers were some of the great names of the 20th century, and numbered in E.M. Foster, and of course Leonard Woolf, the man who became Virginia's husband and whom she married in 1912. Virginia Woolf's first novel, The Voyage Out, was finished by 1913, but owing to a severe mental breakdown after her marriage, it wasn't published until 1915. In 1917, the Woolfs bought a small hand printing press in order to take up printing as a hobby and as therapy for Virginia, and they named their printing house Hogarth Press, and that became a really important press in the development of British modernist literature. So if you haven't read Woolf before, you should know that she did publish in a number of genres, including essays, stories, plays. In 1925, her very famous novel, Mrs. Dalloway, was published, followed by another big breakthrough novel, To the Lighthouse, 1927, and The Waves in 1931. That's considered to be like the Woolf trifecta. She wrote other things, of course, but those are some of the big ones. 2 talks at women's colleges in Cambridge in 1928 led to A Room of One's Own, which was published in 1929. 1930 was a less happy time for the Woolfs. As the 30s progressed, they experienced the death of friends, the prospect of war, and by 1941, when Virginia Woolf had practically completed the final version of her novel Between the Acts, she committed suicide by drowning herself. So she did kind of come to a tragic end, was plagued by mental illness throughout her life, but it's important to kind of know that background about her before we move now to her work, A Room of One's Own. So I'm going to go through this chapter by chapter, just pointing out, I think, some of the more important parts of each chapter. I won't be able to do justice to this book. It's so dense, but there's some really important things in it that I think we should think about and reflect on. So Room of One's Own was was published in 1929, as I mentioned, year after the huge stock market crash that led to the Great Depression, 9 years after American women won the right to vote, 10 years after English women won the right to vote. The main thesis of this text is that women must have money, time, and space in order to write. And such material conditions are essential to the writing of genius. In this book, Woolf is writing most explicitly about women in literature, but her argument might be extended to a more general discussion of the condition of women in society. After all, if women are, as Woolf points out, hampered by lack of funds and excessive demands for or underpaid domestic labor, then they're not going to be able to contribute to society in larger ways. So we can kind of extend her argument a bit. And as I mentioned, this book is based on 2 lectures given at women's colleges in England. You should be aware that Oxford and Cambridge equals Oxbridge, and that neither university admitted women at this moment. They're centuries-old universities dedicated to young men's learning that, as she remarks, have had a lot of money poured into them over the years. In contrast, the first women's college established at Cambridge was Girton in 1860. Newnham, the source of the lecture, was founded 20 years later. So the women's colleges at these universities were much less well-funded. So chapter 1 opens with an important line. But you may say, we asked you to speak about women in fiction. What does that have to do with a room of one's own? Women in fiction remain unresolved problems. This is on page 4. She can come to no conclusion, she says, other than that a woman must have money and a room of her own in order to write. And so this is the real kind of major point that she's making here, obviously. I'm going to just turn quickly to the 3 Marys that she references throughout. There are 3 Marys: Mary Beaton, who is an aunt/narrator, she's kind of like a double Mary; Mary Seton, who's a professor friend; and Mary Carmichael, who's a writer. These Marys are inspired by a 16th century Scots ballad called Mary Hamilton. And I have this on the slide, which tells the story of a woman who defies the restrictions imposed on her. Mary Hamilton was one of Mary Queen of Scots' ladies-in-waiting. She became pregnant by the king, but she refused to be burdened with a baby and threw it into the sea, which is quite a dramatic event. And for this, she was condemned to die. So because she had such a kind of, eventful and romantic life, she was written about here. I'm going to turn next to the significance of the beetle in this text. On page 6, she describes how she finds herself at the men's college walking across the turf or the grass, but, quote, instantly a man's figure rose to intercept me, unquote. He was a beetle, she explains. I was a woman. Only the fellows and scholars are allowed here. The gravel is the only place for me, unquote. Clearly, this is a metaphor for a larger degree of separation of men and women that we see illustrated throughout the work. Men can walk in the grass, women can't. Men have access to the university library, women don't. Men are served delicious food and drink to help nourish their great thinking, women aren't. Woolf says on page 18, one cannot think well, love well, sleep well, if one has not dined well. So she shows us through an embodied experience how men are materially served by society and women aren't. And she compares the difference between the hallowed men's colleges and the much more recent women's colleges in funding on page 20. She asks, why did our mothers have no wealth with which to put into girls' education? That's on page 22. And there's several answers for that. One is, you can't have babies and make money. 2 is law. Law denied women the right to possess money and property. It wasn't until the middle to end of the 19th century that laws were passed that gave women the rights to custody of their children, to sign contracts, to own property, including wages earned. Previously, men had access to all of that through patriarchal law. So the beetle kind of stands in for patriarchal society. That's in chapter 1. I'm going to move now to chapter 2. This takes place at the British Museum, which thankfully admits the female narrator as she embarks on a quest to understand the discrepancies in the lives of men and women. On page 25, she reflects on the prosperity of men and the poverty of women and the effect of these respective economic conditions on writing. At the British Museum, she finds that many men have written extensively on the subject of women, and the reverse is not true. In addition, there's no consensus on the subject of women. Little is to be learned from these studies, she finds. And she introduces us to a fictional Professor Von X, who is engaged in writing the imaginary tome, The Mental, Moral, and Physical Inferiority of the Female Sex. An important passage here is to be found on page 35. She writes, "Women have served all of these centuries as looking glasses, possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural size. Without that power, probably the earth would still be swamp and jungle." On the next page, we learn that if women were not inferior, they would cease to enlarge. And in other words, this is another iteration of the whole concept of the other, which I talked about last week. Confidence in oneself requires the thought that other people are inferior in this understanding of how the world works. Hence, men need to think that women are the lesser sex in order to believe in themselves. So Woolf is, in fact, articulating a gendered idea of the other. On page 37 of this chapter, she states that her legacy of £500 a year is more important than the right to vote. And note that in 1928, £500 had the same buying power as about 32,000 current dollars. So she's looking at basically, being self-sufficient and not needing to work outside the home and not needing to share her space with anyone else in order to do what she really wants to do, which is to write. Okay, I'm going to move on to chapter 3. Here, she is focusing on historical women. And she's discussing the history of England, Professor Trevelyan's History of England, in order to find out what women's lives were like, and thus why women did not write anything when, on page 41, she says, every other man, it seemed, was capable of song or sonnet. The little material she does find illuminates the idea for her that the lives of women were curtailed. They were married off young, they were set to bearing many children, and or undereducated. Plus, of course, they hadn't any resources of their own. On page 44, she writes, in real life, she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. So, to make a point, Woolf invents the character of Judith Shakespeare, I was being too informal. She tries to imagine what a smart and gifted sister of William would have done. In her mind, she, like her brother, wants to live in a larger world than the one that she's been circumscribed by. So when she runs away to London, she's seeking work in the theater, but she only attracts the wrong kind of attention. She becomes pregnant, and she kills herself. This is all fictional. Woolf points out that in her understanding of 16th century England, quote, a highly gifted girl who tried to use her gift for poetry would have been so thwarted and hindered by other people, so tortured and pulled asunder by her own contrary instincts, that she must have lost her health and sanity to a certainty. It's on page 49. In this chapter, she's also referring to Anon, A-N-O-N, as meaning anonymous, representative of countless women who veiled their identities in order to be able to express themselves. Okay, I'm now going to move on to chapter 4, which this chapter uses on the importance of literary traditions for women writers and discusses British literary foremothers like Lady Winchelsea in the 17th century. But while this woman does write poetry, Woolf finds that her mind, quote, is harassed and distracted with hates and grievances, and thus is unable to be incandescent. That's an important word for Woolf. That's page 59. And incandescent basically means that she's able to kind of transcend the kind of grim material realities of the world and, think her way through. She turns to other known women writers and finds them showing promise of writerly genius, but ultimately impeded by their positions as women. On page 65, she notes an important historical event, and that is when middle-class women began to write. And this is important because women writers need precursors and traditions. And she notes the flowering of women writers in the 19th century, including Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot. But she also, interestingly for us, reads Jane Eyre. She compares Jane Austen favorably to Charlotte Bronte and thinks that Bronte allowed her indignation to mark and thus mar her work as her genius was never able to be fully expressed. And on page 73, she writes, "It is clear that anger was tampering with the integrity of Charlotte Bronte, the novelist. She left her story, to which her entire devotion was due, to attend to some personal grievance. She remembered that she had been starved of her proper due of experience. She had been made to stagnate in a parsonage mending stockings when she wanted to wander free over the world. Her imagination swerved from indignation, and we feel it swerve." So that's on page 73. That's her big criticism of Jane Eyre, and that's something that we can discuss this week on the discussion board as well. I'm going to move, I'm sorry, I was on chapter 5. This is chapter 4. I'm now on chapter 5. Sorry about that. I was too fast. So chapter 5 introduces the then contemporary writer, so contemporary writer to 1928-29, Mary Carmichael, who serves as an imaginary sounding board, an imaginary audience on page 89, an inspiration for more thought, a muse for women's thinking. Of Mary Carmichael, Woolf says, "She may have been no genius, but she has advantages of her generation, that she need not rail against men." And the quote on page 93 is, "She wrote as a woman, but as a woman who has forgotten she is a woman." And while she's ultimately dissatisfied with the fictional Mary Carmichael's novel, Woolf does see promise. On page 94, she says, "Give her another 100 years," I concluded. "Give her a room of her own and 500 a year. Let her speak her mind and leave out half that she now puts in, and she will write a better book one of these days. She will be a poet in another 100 years' time." Moving on to chapter 6, she's introducing here the androgynous mind. The androgynous mind is resonant and porous, she says, and that it transmits emotion without impediment. It's naturally creative, incandescent, there's that word again, and undivided. On page 99, she says that she finds male writing to have the hallmarks of freedom, liberty, and thus be straightforward, something that women's writing cannot achieve yet. However, men's writing is also, quote unquote, arid because of its narrow focus. That's on page 100. It's impeded because it's threatened by the possible equality of the opposite sex. That's on 101. So there, she sees that men and women are both affected by gender in different interesting ways, and she's saying that true genius can only come about when we cast off the shackles of the gendered mind, in other words. Of course, the men's shackles are easier to cast off than the women's shackles because the women's are so much rooted in the material. Ultimately, she says on 104, it's fatal for anyone who writes to think about their sex. And on 108, she reiterates the idea, the importance of material wealth and intellectual freedom. Intellectual freedom, she says, and this is on the slide, depends on material things. Poetry depends on intellectual freedom, and women have always been poor, not for 200 years merely, but from the beginning of time. And so she frames, this whole idea is framed by this need for material support in order to be able to write with any sort of genius. Finally, she concludes with an entreaty. She says, okay, so this is what you, her audience, presumably college-age girls and young women, are meant to do. And on 109, she says, I would ask you to write all kinds of books, hesitating at no subject, however trivial or however vast. By hook or by crook, I hope that you will possess yourselves of money enough to travel and idle, to contemplate the future or the past of the world, to dream over books, and to loiter at street corners, and that the line of thought dip deep into the stream. And so she's charging her audience to go out there, experience life without material constraints, and then start the process of incandescent women's writing. Now, it would be interesting to think about what Virginia Woolf would think about contemporary women writers. I'm not sure she would have anticipated the kind of women writing that we have today, which is much, much more diverse than writing that was happening in her own era. At any rate, I will look forward to seeing what you guys have to say this week on the discussion board and elsewhere.